Zhang Tao had never been one for monologues. In the past, when he'd still been human enough to feel, he'd laughed at the long-winded speeches the villains always gave in action movies. They'd stand there, wearing their smug grins, spouting off about their evil plans, as if that somehow made them more terrifying. But that was before they'd removed his ability to laugh, or feel anything else, for that matter. Still, in that moment, standing at the threshold of a corporate boardroom made of reinforced glass and polished chrome, Zhang couldn't help but give it a try. After all, he wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a judgment, a reckoning, an idea manifested in flesh and metal. "You thought you could take away my emotions, my humanity, and control me," he began, his voice booming with more conviction than he had ever imagined it capable of. "But who's the one truly in control now? I'm not here for a meeting. I'm here to—" He was interrupted by a coffee spill. Zhang blinked, momentarily thrown off by the sound of a robotic barista, a small, metallic contraption on wheels, rolling into the room with a tray of coffee cups. As it made its way toward the table of executives, the machine tripped over a wire, sending the entire pot of dark roast cascading onto the shiny floor. The awkward silence was filled only by the robotic apologies, which were far too polite for the tense situation. Zhang glanced down at the steaming coffee pooling at his feet. He looked up at the executives, who sat frozen in their seats, wide-eyed, and clearly struggling to comprehend the absurdity of what had just happened. For a brief moment, Zhang's expression softened. He knew he was here to deal out punishment, to restore the broken parts of himself by punishing those who had taken so much from him. But sometimes, it felt hard to stay angry when life kept throwing such ridiculous distractions into the mix. He shook his head, a sardonic grin spreading across his face. He'd been designed to be ruthless. To be a weapon. But he was still human enough, wasn't he, to find something deeply absurd about a coffee machine ruining his big moment, right? He said, pushing the thought from his mind. "Where was I?" "You were about to kill us," said one of the executives, his voice trembling. For what reason?" Zhang paused. He looked at the terrified men and women in front of him. These were the architects of his pain. The ones who had taken away everything that made him human, the ones who had turned him into this unstoppable weapon. And yet, here they were, sitting in front of him, asking him why he had come for them. "Because I am your punishment," he thought. But he wasn't sure if he even believed that anymore. His mind kept drifting back to the beginning, back to the day he'd first walked into Arctis Technologies, an eager employee with a slight nervousness in his step, excited by the possibilities of a future he couldn't quite picture, but sure it would be worth it. Zhang had been just like any other young, hopeful person. A dreamer. A man in love with a woman he barely knew, with a career that seemed to stretch endlessly in front of him. But that was before he had signed the contract, before they had stripped him of everything, one layer at a time. The memory wasn't painful, not anymore, but it gnawed at him all the same, a constant reminder of what had been taken. The strange part, though, was that his emotions had begun to fade, even the anger he had once felt at the injustice of it all. The more he thought about the betrayal, the more he realized something troubling. The anger wasn't real. At least, not in the way he remembered it. He wasn't sure when it started, or how, but over time, the rage that had been his fuel seemed to diminish. Was this what they had done to him? Slowly, subtly, erasing even his need for justice? His mind began to spiral inwards, questioning everything. What was justice? Was it just vengeance dressed up in righteous clothes? The room was silent. Zhang snapped back to the present, his mission clear once again. "You," he said, his voice unwavering. "You created me. And now, I will do the same to you. I will judge you." The man at the far end of the table, the CEO, cleared his throat and then leaned forward. His eyes were a sharp, calculating blue, his lips thin with fear. He was the one who had orchestrated Zhang's transformation, the one who had seen potential in him, but only as a tool. "Zhang," he began, his voice smooth and practiced, as though he were trying to reason with an animal. We both know you're not in control here. You can't kill us. The world has seen your face. You're a hero now, an icon. They'll never let you. Zhang tilted his head slightly. You think I care about that? About being a hero? The CEO hesitated, clearly surprised by Zhang's reaction. You don't? Then why? I'm not here to be a hero, Zhang said with a harsh chuckle. I'm here to be something much worse. Before anyone could respond, Zhang moved. In a flash, he was at the head of the table, his enhanced legs carrying him effortlessly across the room. The CEO's eyes widened as Zhang gripped the back of his chair, his fingers pressing into the leather. I am the weapon you made, Zhang continued, his face now inches from the CEO's. But I am no longer your tool. I will give you the judgment you deserve. The CEO swallowed hard, clearly realizing the gravity of the situation. His hands shook, but he remained seated, a faint hope glimmering in his eyes. Perhaps he still thought he could talk his way out of it. Zhang studied him, remembering the day he had first been brought into Arctis Technologies. The promise of something bigger. The promise of a better world. The promise of a future that would be his, built with the technologies of tomorrow. A future where he could make a difference. Instead, they had taken everything from him. They had stripped away his ability to love, to feel, to dream. They had built him to be a weapon and had never once considered what it would do to the man underneath the enhancements. A small part of him, the part that still clung to the hope of his former life, wanted to walk away. Wanted to forget all of this and find a way back to the man he once was. But another part of him, the part that had been forged in blood and steel, demanded judgment, and he would not stop until the scales were balanced. The room was still. Not a single sound but the hum of machinery in the walls. Zhang slowly stood up straight, his gaze still locked on the CEO. I've come to judge you. And that judgment will be final. The CEO swallowed, his throat constricting as Zhang Tao's shadow loomed over him. The boardroom felt smaller now, the cold metallic walls seeming to close in. The air was thick, heavy with a mixture of fear and the unspoken knowledge that this moment was inevitable. They had created him, nurtured him in the laboratory, shaped him into something they could control. But now the creation had become the creator's executioner. I didn't expect this, the CEO muttered, trying to muster some shred of composure, but his voice quivered with desperation. We gave you everything. Everything you ever wanted. You were meant to be our greatest asset, Zhang. The world was going to look up to you, to idolize you. You could have been a hero. Zhang's gaze never wavered. Hero. That word, once something that seemed so alluring, now seemed like a cheap mask. A fabricated illusion. He wasn't a hero. Heroes had emotions. Heroes fought for ideals, for people. Heroes cared. What was he if not a weapon, a product? A tool built to serve their whims, designed to be detached, to feel nothing? But here he was, standing in front of the very people who had engineered his transformation, and instead of anger, instead of righteous fury, there was doubt. A gnawing question that had been burrowing deeper into his mind ever since he had begun this mission. Was any of this even real? Was he truly right to do this? To judge them? To punish them for what they had done? He took a slow step back, his mind reeling. He had been designed to execute, to eliminate, to neutralize the threats. But this didn't feel like justice. It felt like something else. Something colder. Did you really think? Zhang's voice broke through the silence, his tone barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions, that I was going to be your perfect weapon? Did you think I wouldn't realize the cost of what you did to me? The CEO's lips trembled. He tried to maintain his posture, but there was no denying the fear that had seeped into his eyes. He looked at the others in the room, trying to gauge if anyone would speak up, if anyone would save him. But they were all silent. Their lives rested in Zhang's hands now, and they knew it. Zhang felt his chest tighten, but there was no physical pain. Just the familiar, hollow feeling that had been growing within him. The emptiness that had been forced into him, piece by piece. He had been engineered to be a perfect soldier, to feel nothing, to erase his own needs, his desires. But now, staring down at the man who had torn him apart, he couldn't help but wonder if this all had been worth it. "Why did you do it?" Zhang asked, his voice steady but piercing. "Why did you take everything from me? Why did you create me like this?" The CEO's mouth opened as if to speak, but the words never came. There was nothing he could say that would make it right. Nothing that could erase the years of manipulation, the horrors they had subjected him to, the cold surgeries and treatments that had turned him into a tool. The CEO stammered, trying to regain control, but it was no use. He knew that Zhang wasn't asking for excuses. He wasn't asking for explanations. He was asking for the one thing that no one could give him anymore. The one thing that had been taken away from him long ago. Zhang's hands clenched into fists, the cool, metallic enhancements on his body sending faint vibrations through his muscles. A ripple of power surged through him, but it didn't feel the way it used to. The surge didn't feel like triumph or victory. It felt empty. He released the tension in his fists, taking a deep breath. The rage was gone. There was nothing left. Not even the hatred. Just nothing. The irony was not lost on him. They had made him this way. They had removed his humanity, thinking that would make him a better soldier. But in doing so, they had removed the very thing that could make him human again. The thing that could redeem him, even in the wake of all that had been taken. His ability to feel. The one thing he needed in order to decide what to do next. Zhang turned away from the CEO and walked to the window, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. The glass wall stretched out before him, offering a view of the city skyline far below. He could see the faint glow of streetlights twinkling in the distance, the hum of life continuing on, oblivious to the battle taking place in this sterile, air-conditioned room. It seemed so far away, so distant. It was as if he were standing outside of himself, watching his own life unfold in real time, but unable to participate. His mind flickered back to the days before his transformation. He remembered walking down busy streets, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, hearing the laughter of people. He remembered her. Xiao Mei. He could still see her in his mind, though the details had blurred with time. The way she smiled, the way her eyes had sparkled when they talked about their future. They had talked about dreams, silly dreams of growing old together, of building a family, of seeing the world. They had both been naive, but at least they had been alive. They had had the emotions that made them human. The things that mattered. Zhang's heart, what was left of it, tightened in his chest. That was the truth, wasn't it? He hadn't come here to punish them. He had come here to reclaim what had been taken. To find the parts of himself that were still whole, if only they still existed somewhere deep inside of him. But the truth was, they didn't. He heard the soft shuffle of footsteps behind him and turned just as one of the executives, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp features and a pinched expression, stood up. She had been quiet throughout the entire exchange, watching him with a mix of awe and apprehension. She cleared her throat. "Zhang," she said softly, her voice shaky but determined. "Please. You have to understand. We didn't know it would turn out this way. We never meant to." He held up a hand, silencing her. "I don't need your apologies," Zhang said. "There's nothing you can say now that will change anything. I'm not here for you anymore. I'm not here for any of you." The woman faltered, her eyes widening. "What do you mean?" "I'm here for me," Zhang answered, the words simple, but carrying the weight of everything he had been through. "I was created to be the weapon you wanted, but I'm not that anymore. You took away the most important thing in the world, my humanity. And now I'm nothing." There was a long pause. The room seemed to hold its breath, and the quiet hum of the building felt like the only sound in the universe. Zhang's eyes were distant as he stared into the cityscape, his hand still cold and unnervingly still, and then, almost imperceptibly, he shook his head. He didn't need to punish them. There was no point. The final judgment had already been passed. Zhang Tao's eyes lingered on the city, the skyline glimmering under the artificial lights. He could feel the steady beat of the heart he no longer truly understood. He used to be like them, those who lived below, in the heart of the city, wrapped in their emotions and dreams. He remembered the tastes of life, the simplicity of it all. And yet, now, everything seemed distant, a world behind glass, cold and untouchable. He had been stripped of the very thing that connected him to it. Behind him, the tension in the room was palpable. They were waiting. But Zhang had stopped caring about their fate. What did it matter if he destroyed them or let them live? The choice had stopped being his a long time ago. He wasn't the same person who had walked in here with vengeance in mind. He had crossed into a place where judgment didn't feel like justice, it felt like indifference. A shudder passed through him, though not physically. The emotions, the ones they had taken, had been returned, or at least reawakened, in a way he couldn't understand. He wasn't sure if it was because of the confrontation, or because of the realization that he was simply one piece in a much larger puzzle, but it didn't matter anymore. He had been a puppet on strings, his emotions twisted into something unrecognizable. He turned slowly to face them. The executives, their faces still pale and drawn, were awaiting their execution, or at least their judgment. They had been wrong in what they had done, but Zhang had come to understand something deeper. He was just as trapped as they were. They had removed his humanity to create a weapon, but in doing so, they had merely replicated a system of oppression. He had been their prisoner long before he had ever been created. Zhang's hand found its way to the window, pressing against the cold glass. It felt like the last tether to the world that had once been his. But now, the world was like this room, empty, sterile. A cage that had been constructed piece by piece until he was standing in the center of it, waiting for the inevitable conclusion. "We're sorry," the woman spoke again, her voice softer this time, as if trying to reach him. "We thought we were doing the right thing. You were supposed to save us all." Her words didn't stir any sympathy in him. Instead, they echoed something else. Save us all. It was a phrase meant for saviors, heroes, those who could still believe in something. Zhang had never been one of them. And now, with his emotions returning in this fractured, broken form, he could feel it, the painful truth. "You never understood what it meant," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "You never understood what it meant to live." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. He could hear the soft whirring of machinery embedded deep in the walls, but it felt so distant. As if even the technology that once empowered him had started to fade into obsolescence, an empty echo of something that no longer held meaning. His hand, still on the window, moved slowly downward. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Zhang felt the pull of something faint but undeniable, rising from deep inside him. It was an emotion, or at least the semblance of one. But it wasn't anger. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't even sadness. It was an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. Of having lived in a world that had stripped him of everything that had once been precious, only to give him back the shards of a life he could never piece together. His vision blurred for a moment, and he realized he hadn't been blinking. He hadn't been able to blink in what felt like years, not since they'd done whatever they had done to him in that sterile lab, draining away all the human fragility they had deemed unnecessary. He turned back toward them, his expression unreadable. His breath came in short bursts, and he fought to steady himself, to control the feeling bubbling beneath the surface. The one thing they hadn't taken was the capacity for questioning. It was the last vestige of his humanity, the only thing they hadn't erased. It was the thing that made him ask, why? Zhang looked at the group before him. These people, who had once been his superiors, the ones who had led him to believe in his transformation. Now they were just people. Weak, fallible. A part of him had expected to feel some sense of satisfaction at their downfall, but there was nothing. Just a hollow ringing in his ears, like a bell that had long since stopped echoing. A soft, unspoken understanding passed between them. They had been waiting for his final act. But Zhang was not interested in their fear anymore. It no longer mattered whether he struck them down, one by one. He had already lost his reason. He walked toward the door, and as he did, the sound of his boots echoed loudly, like thunder in a still sky. The sound reverberated in the cold, empty space, and with each step, the weight on his chest seemed to lift just a little. The further he walked, the clearer it became, he wasn't walking toward them anymore. He wasn't even walking away. He was just walking. But he reached the door, his hand brushing against the cold metal handle, and paused. He wasn't sure what to do now. The mission that had brought him here felt as empty as the room behind him. His purpose, the one they had created for him, had dissolved into a question without an answer. They had used him to play their game. They had made him their perfect soldier. But in doing so, they had inadvertently opened his eyes to something far worse than they had ever intended. Zhang turned back to them, just as the door clicked shut behind him. "You want to know why I came?" His voice was soft now, almost tired. "It wasn't to punish you. It was to punish myself. Because I was just like you. I thought I could be a tool, a weapon. I thought I could be something I'm not. But the truth is, there's no justice in what I've done. Only the hollow echo of what's been taken. And I'm not sure I can get it back." The room was silent. No one moved. But Zhang didn't care anymore. With one last look, he stepped out of the room. His footsteps faded as he moved down the hallway, away from the building, away from the corporate empire that had created him. Outside, the city lights flickered in the distance, cold and indifferent. He walked through the streets, blending in with the anonymous crowd, no longer a soldier, no longer a weapon. And for the first time in a long time, Zhang Tao didn't feel like he was chasing something. He wasn't hunting. He wasn't a judge or a jury. He was simply walking, and maybe, just maybe, that was the only freedom he would ever know.